All right, today we're going to start a new topic. In my opinion, it's actually probably one of the most important topics in the course because if you really think about a lot of the environmental issues we talk about this year, they all seem to tie back to the fact that there are simply too many people on planet Earth. 7 billion is a pretty big number, and that number just keeps growing. So this unit's topic is population. We're going to deal with it first from more of a biological perspective, just how do populations in nature tend to grow and change, and then we're going to apply that more specifically to the human population condition and ask the question, how did we get to a point where we are now at 7 billion people today? So I'm going to try and again move pretty quickly through this. It should take about the equivalent of a class period. There is some math, so if you don't have a calculator, you may want to grab one now before you get going. But here we go. So first and foremost, what is a population? We've talked about ecosystems and communities and so forth, but a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular area. Now we'll go over some of the more specific characteristics of populations in class together, but some of the most fundamental characteristics are simply the size, how many individuals there are. An important one actually is density. If you were to compare the population of the United States and a country like Bangladesh, well, the U.S. has over 300 million people. Bangladesh has something like 150 million people. And so you'd say, oh, well, yeah, the United States is a much bigger nation, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at the density, Bangladesh is probably smaller than the state of Colorado. So imagine fitting half of the United States population into an area the size of Colorado. In that sense, you're talking about a very high population density in Bangladesh, and that really does seem to affect the dynamics that you will see in a population and how it changes. Another important factor that we'll look at is the age-sex distribution. How many males relative to females will affect certain aspects of the growth of that population. But one that perhaps is often overlooked, but actually which has a great deal of significance on population growth, is the age structure of that population. In other words, how many young individuals versus reproductive age individuals versus elderly individuals. And we will see how that age distribution really does have dramatic impacts on the growth of human populations around the globe. Another factor has to do with the dispersion of those populations. So just give me a second here. Okay, sorry for that small glitch. But the dispersion of different populations, in other words, how do you find them distributed in nature? Some of the patterns we see involve clumping patterns, which is actually, no, that's not true. Letter A is actually random patterns. So for example, a field of dandelions, wherever the dandelion seed fell is where you're going to find that individual grown. Probably the most common type you see in systems is what's known as clumping. So as you see here in this middle diagram, you have small clusters of elephants grouped together as they travel through an ecosystem. And because you see a lot of gregarious nature or herding behavior in a lot of animals, clumping is actually relatively common. And lastly, you have a uniform distribution as you see in image C. And I don't know if you could tell, but if you were to look at any of these bushes, they're almost exactly equally spaced from one another, almost as if someone went in there and intentionally planted them that way. But this is actually a natural phenomenon we find in certain cases in nature under conditions of high amounts of intra-specific competition. So in this particular environment, there's not a lot of water because it's a desert environment. So each of these plants is growing a root crown pretty uniformly, and so those root crowns are going to bang into the root crowns of other plants to the point where they end up growing perfectly equidistant from one another in order to limit the amount of competition they have with one another. So when they're competing for scarce resources, you often see this pattern. Another place you see this is actually in penguins. If you look at the nesting sites of penguins, each penguin is almost exactly like 3 feet apart from the other penguins. So they've all sort of staked out their claim that this is my little nest, this is where I'm raising my egg, and because space is so limited in those environments, they're all equidistant from one another. So those are just some typical characteristics or fundamentals of populations. But what we're most interested probably in this unit is how do populations change over time? How do they get bigger, smaller, or in fact, sometimes they do stay the same size? So it's very simple. This is not rocket science. You know, in a population, you can add to a population through births. Conversely, you could subtract via deaths. And then you could also add to a population, in certain instances, through immigration. Or you can take away through what is known as emigration. So those four factors are really the only options you have to either add or remove from a population. Now, if we combine these four variables, you can come up with a very, very simple equation, which says if I want to know the population in a year from now, so n represents the population in 1 year, what you do is you start with the existing population, usually n sub 0, and then we add births plus immigrants and subtract the deaths and immigrants. And if you do this, you add the number of births and immigrants, subtract the deaths and immigrants to that original number, you will get the new population for the following year. And we call this sometimes the BIDE parameters because you have B, I, D, and E representing the four main variables that dictate population size. And you can apply this to, say, like staples. You know, let's say you want to know what the population of staples is going to be next year. You take the existing population, let's just say it's 1,600 kids. Hopefully there won't be any deaths. There won't be any new births being added to the staples population. So in this particular case, we would add the immigrants, which would basically be the incoming freshmen next year, along with any sort of kids who are transferring. Subtract the graduating seniors and any kids transferring out of the school, and that would give you your population of staples the following year. Okay, so as I said, very simple addition, subtraction. Now, what's going to affect the rate of change of a population, though, while these are the concrete factors that will affect population size, the number of births or the number of deaths or the number of immigrants or emigrants are largely affected by the conditions or the things happening in that particular environment. So some of the environmental factors that will influence these factors include food availability. If there's more food available, that means individuals are normally more healthy. That might encourage them to have more babies, or it could discourage individuals from dying. How much space is available can be a factor. The level of predation or disease is another important factor that would most certainly affect the number of deaths. The number of mates that are available can obviously affect how many births you will have. Going back to age structure, just imagine the difference in the number of births that could occur if you have a situation where there's one male and 1,000 females versus one female and 1,000 males. That age structure difference would drastically affect the number of births in that population. There's just all various forms of competition that can affect these various BIDE parameters. And then there are other things like environmental disasters, a tsunami, a hurricane, whatever else that could affect deaths. And those sorts of conditions also affect, whether individuals might emigrate from a country, for example, if we're talking about the human population. So, later on in our discussion, we'll focus more on how these particular factors affect number of births, deaths, emigrants, and immigrants. Okay? All right, so moving on. It's convenient to create models of population growth if we're going to try and predict where a population is going to end up several years from now. And so a few very simple mathematical models have been developed to try and describe the behavior of population changes. So just to kind of give you some context, when there's no environmental constraints, when there's nothing sort of inhibiting a population from growing in any way, shape, or form, the population can grow at its maximum capacity. And when a population grows at its maximum capacity, that's known as its biotic potential. Okay? That's the maximum capacity for growth in a population. Now that's assuming all conditions are perfect, everyone's reproducing at their maximum rate. You know, it sounds pretty outlandish, but it's said that a typical human female could, under perfect conditions, have about 30 kids during her lifetime. And I think the world record is something like 72, which is just absurd. But a typical female could be expected to have between 20 or 30 kids during her lifetime. Now, do you often see women having that many kids? No, because there are other sorts of constraints that limit that level of growth. But given perfect conditions, that would be our maximum capacity for growth. Now, even though that's pretty extreme, if you look at some other species, like a fly, for example, under perfect conditions, a single fly could maybe give birth or lay thousands upon thousands of eggs during her lifetime. So the biotic potential for different species does vary pretty significantly based upon their biology and so forth. So just understand, biotic potential is the maximum capacity for growth. In addition, the rate of growth is then called the intrinsic rate of increase. Okay? And that is typically designated by the letter R. Now, when you're talking about unlimited resources, the intrinsic rate of increase represents the biotic potential. It's the maximum rate of growth. But as we start to go through more specific examples, we're just going to use the term R to represent the actual rate of growth for various populations. So how do you determine the rate of increase? It's very, very simple. First, you got to figure out the birth rate. So that's the percentage of new births in a year. So if you have a population of 100 and 20 babies are born that year, the rate is simply 20 births per 100 individuals gives you a rate of 0.2, or little b. Then you got to find the death rate. Do the same exercise, find the total population to start with, 100, the number of total deaths in that year, and then to figure the rate, do 10 divided by 100, you get 0.1, and that's little d, or the death rate. So then to find the actual intrinsic rate of growth for that population, you just do births minus deaths, and that will give you little r. So in this case, 0.2 is the births, 0.1 is the deaths. That gives you an r value, or a rate of increase, of 0.1. But what does that mean? All that means is that every year, the existing population is going to increase by 10%. Okay? But this is the key part that you need to take away when talking about population growth. This is not a fixed increase amount. This is not saying that this population will increase by 10 individuals each and every year. It's saying that this population will grow by 10% each and every year. And therefore, given the size of the existing population, if you're talking about an existing population of 100 individuals, then 10% is only 10 individuals. If you're talking about a base population, though, of 1 million individuals, well, 10% of 1 million is much more significant. That's 100,000 individuals being increased. So keep in mind, we're talking about percentage increases, not fixed amount increases. And when a population does grow at a constant rate of increase, year after year after year, I'm sure you all are aware of this term by now, but this is referred to as exponential growth. Okay? And graphically, if you were to graph it, you typically get what's known as a J curve, because you have very minor increase at the beginning, but then as time goes on and the base population increases, then you get much more drastic increases as you go further in time. Now, some math. I know equations like this tend to scare people quite a bit. They see dn dt and they flip out. But it doesn't get any simpler than this. All dn dt is representing is the amount of change in that population. Okay? That's all it is. It's the change in the population. So how do we figure that out? Well, you have r times n. All that means is if you know the population this year, n, and you know the rate of growth, r, you know how much that population should change by in the coming year. So just as an example down here, if you look down here for a moment, if you have a population of 100 individuals, that's your n, and your growth rate is 5%, so as a decimal that's 0.05, it's asking how big will that population be in a year from now. And so essentially all you need to do is the following. Let me just try and get my pen ready. Just a moment. Okay. So n equals 100, r equals 0.05. So if you do 100 times 0.05, the dndt, the change, is simply 5 individuals. Now if I wanted to calculate what that population should be a year from now, all I have to do is take the existing population, 100, add how much it changed by, which in this case is 5, and your new population is 105. It's that simple. So that's how you would use, if you know the growth rate, how you can calculate the change from one year to the next in a population. Now keep in mind, going back up to here, if r is positive, if it's ever positive, the population is going to grow in size. If r is 0, that means there's no change in the population, and so the population is going to remain the same year after year after year. While if r is negative, then the population will decrease over time. Okay? Now, this was easy enough to do the calculation for 1 year. It gets a little more tedious as you start to move out in years. So if you were to do 3 years from now, there's actually 2 ways of doing this. The really tedious way is to take, alright, so I already know my first year is 105, so in year 2 I got to do 105. Yeah, here we go. You got to do 105 times 0.05, and that'll give you, what's the number we got here? Plug it in your calculator, that gives you 5.25. Then you got to add 5.25 to 105 to give you the new population size, which would be 110.25. Okay, so that's the population in year 3. I mean in year 2. Then you got to continue the process again, where now you take 110.25 times 0.05, and that'll give you, in this case, 5.5125. Add that to the existing population of 1.25, and now you're up to 115.7625. Another simpler way to do this is if you just did 100 times 1.05. So that's basically saying you're multiplying by itself plus 5%. That would give you 105. Then if you did 105 times 1.05, that would give you the 5.5125. Then if you did, I just got confused. 110.25. Forgive me for 1 second. 105 times 1.05 gives you 110.25. And then if you did 110.25 times 1.05, that would give you 115.7625. Okay? Sorry for that confusion. But you can do this on and on and on for however many years you want to project a population out into the future. But admittedly, this is a little bit tedious, and we'll show you a different way of doing it in just a bit. But what I do want to point out, though, is the key thing here is that you are not adding the same amount each and every year. The first year, we only added 5 individuals, okay? 100 plus 5 gave us 105. But because we're growing by the same percentage, in the second year, we actually increased not by 5, but by 5.25. And then in the third year, we increased by 5.5125. So my point being, each time you're increasing by a slightly larger quantity. Not a larger rate, the rate stays the same, but the actual amount you're adding increases a little bit at a time. And this is the essence of exponential growth, because as you get to really much larger populations, that amount of increase goes up dramatically. Just quickly though, you can do the reverse direction. If you have a negative growth rate, you would just do 100 times 0.02, since the growth rate is negative 2%. That would give you 2 individuals, but now you just do 100 minus 2 equals 98. So now your population has shrunk. Graphically, what does this all look like? If I was to give you this set of data, I'm just going to do a very rough graph with you now. But just keep in mind, when you do a graph like this, your x-axis is usually time in years, and it needs to be continuous. So you can't just skip around with your axes. You got to go by regular intervals. In this case, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. And then you should also have an appropriate scale for your population. So look at what your max population is. In this case, it's 1,067. So I might do by hundreds, 100, 200, 300, 400, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1100, okay? And you would normally label your axes, right? What I want you to see is this characteristic J curve. At time 0, you're only down here at 10 individuals. At year 5, you're still way down here. Year 10, you're still way down here. At year 15, you're about halfway to 100. Then you're just a little bit higher than halfway. And then you finally hit that 100 mark. So far, though, looking at this overall scale, you've barely changed. But then things start to pick up because now your base population is a bit bigger. So by year 30, you're at 159. And then at year 35, you're at 256. And then 400. And then 663. And then by the end of this time period, you're way up here. So again, very small changes at the onset, but then those changes really start to pick up as you go on, giving us that characteristic J curve. Now, if I can go back for a moment, if you remember doing these calculations, they were pretty tedious. You go year by year by year, and you got to take the old answer and plug in the new stuff, and it's just quite tedious. So if I was to say what's the population going to be 1,000 years from now, it would take me forever to do 1,000 calculations. So with the aid of a little calculus, we can actually use what we call the NERT equation instead, which is this guy here. And even though it says n sub 1, it really should say n sub t, because this can allow you to predict a population to any year t in the future. So if we just do a quick example, you'd plug in your calculator the following. The population is 100 in n sub 0. Alright, that's the initial population. Then you gotta hit the little E button on your calculator to the 0.05, which is the growth rate, times, in this case, 3 years for t. And when you plug that into your calculator, you end up getting 116.183. Now, if you compared that to the other situation we had earlier, where we aged the population 3 years, I don't know why it ended up here, but we got an answer of basically 115.7625. And so the two answers are pretty close, okay? 116.183. And so if you're ever calculating a population way out into the future, let's say it was 50 years, you can just plug 50 in for t, keep everything else the same, 100 e to the 0.05, and then times 50. And that'll give you a population projection for 50 years into the future. Okay? So moving beyond that, let me just pause for a second. Okay, sorry about that. So just to give you another example, here's one where we're projecting out to 35 years. The subpopulation was, or the initial population was 100, e to the 0.05 times 35 in this case. You plug that into your computer or into your calculator, and you end up with an answer of 575.46. Okay? And then just one more example. You have 100 e to the 0.05 times 14 years. And when you plug that in, you end up with an answer of 201.375. Now, I use this particular example because if you notice, 201 is roughly twice the size of our initial population. And what I wanted to show you is another interesting trick that you're really going to need to know well with respect to this population unit, because so far we've done most of our calculations on a calculator, but on the AP exam, sadly, there is no calculator. So you're going to need to know how to calculate rates and so forth using some other methods. And the method that we're going to talk about is something known as the doubling time. Okay? Now, so there's this neat little nifty trick, and actually in a future class we're going to go over why this trick actually works. But for now, just know that you can do 70, the number 70, divided by the growth rate as a percentage, and that will give you the number of years it will take for a population to double. That's why it's called the doubling time. So if I did 70, just the number 70, that's a constant, divided by 5%, which is the growth rate, that means that a population growing at 5% will double in 14 years. So to just illustrate that with some math, if I have a population that has 100 members in it and it's growing at a growth rate of 10%, how big will that population be? Well, first it's asking what's the doubling time. So what's interesting is most of us are tempted to go to this number 100, but when you're calculating doubling time, you don't need the population size. You really just do the following. The number 70 divided by the growth rate as a percentage, 70 divided by 10 gives you 7 years. So what that means is it takes 7 years for this population to double. So in 7 years, this population would become 200 individuals. And this is actually a useful tool for stuff like, banking and bank accounts. Because if you have a savings account that, for example, grows at a rate of 2%, okay, and you have $100 in that bank account, and it's growing at 2%, well, how long is it going to take for that $100 you put in the bank to become $200? And all you do is 70 divided by 2 gives you 35 years for your money to double at a 2% growth rate. Okay? But one more question with relation to doubling time. Now you have a population that has 1 million members, and they're growing at a rate of 10%. So what's the doubling time for this population? And if you're catching on, you'll realize the same percentage, same doubling time. Okay? No difference. Has nothing to do with the starting population. That has no effect on the doubling time. But what is interesting now, though, is how big will this population be in 7 years? Now this population will be 2 million individuals because you're doubling from 1 million to 2 million. And I think this example really illustrates the true nature of exponential growth. Adding 100 individuals seems pretty modest. It's not a huge change, okay, when growing at 10%. But when you have a large base population to start with, an increase of 10% over 7 years seems like a huge change. You've added a whole nother million individuals. So one of the key factors, obviously having a high growth rate is important, but also the size of the base population is an important factor driving the increase of size of populations. Okay? So you could read through this on your own. It just illustrates how truly powerful exponential growth can be. It implies that just a small number of organisms grown without restraint can pretty much take over the planet in no time. One fly in 13 months can become 5.6 trillion flies through their intrinsic rate of growth. And then if you gave them just a few years, there'd be enough flies to cover the entire surface of the Earth to a depth of several feet. That's pretty dramatic. But just to tie this back to some of the other topics we've talked about, there is an individual, a historical figure, who was the first to really recognize this potential for growth in organisms, and that individual was Thomas Robert Malthus, who did a lot of writing back in the late 1700s about population growth in England, and we'll talk a lot more about Malthus. But what's interesting is Malthus' idea of overpopulation leading to competition was one of the key factors that led to Darwin coming up with this theory of evolution by natural selection. So all this population theory has had a dramatic impact on our understanding of the natural world. But going back to this example of the trillion flies, does this growth rate, or does this rapid growth ever actually occur in nature? And the reality is, no, at least not indefinitely. And the reason you can't have this growth occurring is because there are limitations. There's limited resources on Earth, whether that's food or space or what have you. So no population can grow completely unchecked indefinitely. And so what you end up with is perhaps a more accurate or realistic model of growth in natural systems, which we call logistic growth. Okay? Logistic growth or logarithmic growth, which is often characterized not by a J-curve, but by what we call an S-curve. Okay? Now, if you recall earlier in the notes, we talked about all the different factors that can affect how many births or deaths there are going to be in a population. And so this is where we start to bring those factors back into play. And we call all these factors that limit population growth environmental resistance. Okay? And these include those same things we mentioned earlier, things like food availability, space availability, predation, disease, number of mates, and so forth. Now, in a given environment, there is always going to be limits because of these factors of how many individuals can be supported in that particular environment. And we call that limit the carrying capacity. And just read this very carefully. It is the number of individuals of a given species that can be sustained, and here's the key word, indefinitely in a particular area. Can you exceed your carrying capacity? Sure. But while you're exceeding your carrying capacity, you're also depleting your pool of resources, and eventually those resources will run dry, and that population will collapse. But when you're at your carrying capacity, resources are being replenished as quickly as they're being utilized or used. And so that particular population can sustain itself indefinitely under those conditions. Now, just like we had for exponential growth, there's a simple mathematical model to represent how a population will change in response to its carrying capacity or in response to these forms of environmental resistance. So just to give you some examples of this, oops, oh, that was bad. All right, so just to give you some examples of this, we're going to follow this equation here. Now, you'll note we've already seen part of this equation before. This dn dt equals Rn is exactly the equation for exponential growth, or the amount of change due to exponential growth. However, now we've added this additional factor. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. N represents the existing population. K represents the carrying capacity of that particular environment. And so what you're basically doing is saying, all right, based on how much of my carrying capacity I've already filled, I'm only going to grow at a certain fraction of my total intrinsic rate of growth. But this will make much more sense if we do some examples, so let's just jump right into it. If you have a population of 100 individuals, and they're living in an area that could support 1,000 individuals, and the growth rate is 10%. So R is 10%, so using the equation, I'm going to do 0.1 for R. N is 100 individuals, and then this 1 minus N, which is 100, over K, which is 1,000. That's the carrying capacity. Now, if I do this out, 0.1 times 100 is going to give me 10 individuals. But now that I've already filled up a fraction of my environment, I've basically already filled up 10%. This becomes 1 minus 0.1, or 0.9. So a way to think about this is, when I've already filled up 10% of my environment, or when there's 90% of my environment left to fill up, I only grow at 90% of my maximum capacity. So under normal exponential growth, I would have added 10 individuals. Now I'm actually only adding 9 individuals. So if I had to calculate what the new population is going to be, my starting population was 100. Now I've added 9, and that gives me 109 individuals. Now if you go further into the future to a point where you're at 500 individuals, let's do the same thing. Growth rate, intrinsic growth rate is 0.1 times 500, but now it's 1 minus 500 over the carrying capacity of 1,000. If I do 0.1 times 500, that's going to give me 50, and that's normally how many I would have added if this population was growing exponentially. But I've already filled up half of my environment, right? 500 over 1,000 is 0.5. 1 minus 0.5 means that I'm only growing at 50% of my maximum potential. So 50% of 50 gives you 25. So again, normally under exponential growth, I would have gone from 500 to 550. But now it's 500 plus 25, so my new population is 525. And then just to kind of round out the example, now if you have a population of 900 individuals, again, intrinsic rate is 0.1 times 900 times 1 minus 900 over 1,000. What this is saying is that I've already filled up 90% of my environment. So there's a lot of environmental pressure. If I do the math out, 0.1 times 900 gives you 90. And again, that's what I should have added if I was growing exponentially. But now you get 1 minus 0.9 gives you 0.1. So I'm only growing at 0.1 or 10% of my maximum capacity. So rather than adding 90 individuals when I'm this close to my carrying capacity, I only add 9. And so if I do 900 plus what I've added, the new population then would be 909. And if you were to graph all this out, when the population is really low, you're growing close to your maximum capacity, so the graph looks more like an exponential graph. But then as you start to reach the middle of your capacity, the growth rate starts to slow. And then as you reach the carrying capacity, you add less and less and less until you reach that carrying capacity here. And that's your characteristic S-curve. Okay? All right, I'm going to leave the rest alone. If you guys can review a lot of that information, go back, practice a few problems. If you can answer the few questions on the following page, that would be most helpful so we can begin our discussion in class and go over any questions you guys might have. Thanks.